we at Open Europe done this interesting exercise of going through thousands of impact assessments prepared by the UK government, and we have picked the top 100 cost list. I mean, top of the list we can find, for example, the Working Time Directive, whose annual cost is estimated at around over £4 billion, and then we have climate change targets, and then we have the capital standards for the banking sector, the so-called CRD4 directive. I mean, there are a few. This top 100 list includes a bit of everything, and there are a couple of interesting points that can be made about this list. For example, we see that in a quarter of cases, 26 of these regulations have a higher estimated cost than benefit, because the UK government usually puts a figure on costs and benefits, and in 26 cases the estimated cost is higher than the benefit. So these regulations actually impose a net cost, and nonetheless the UK government has signed off on it. And in 31 cases, so almost a third of these regulations, there are no quantifiable benefits. I can give you an example, the Working Time Directive again, but also the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. So in these cases the UK government does say that these regulations will come with a better work-life balance in the case of the Working Time Directive, or investor protection and more transparency in case of the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, but there is no figure on it.
But isn't that slightly unfair that if there are those other benefits that spill over, maybe if the government hasn't quantified them, you can think of benefits that go along with a better work-life balance, perhaps less cost to the NHS. I mean, depends how far you extend it. That some of these policies were not introduced to save businesses money or to make the UK richer, perhaps, were they? They were introduced with other priorities in mind. I mean, some of the climate change ones, for example.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the climate change one is a slightly different story, because there are quantified benefits in that case, but we think that those benefits have been overestimated, because the impact assessment is based on assumptions that have failed to materialize. For example, on the climate change strategy, the assumption was that there was going to be a global climate change deal. That to date, there hasn't been one, so this huge estimated benefit, which is over £20 billion a year, has failed to materialize so far. And we do accept that, of course, regulation does come with benefits at the EU level. For example, all those regulations that can boost trade across the single market, those regulations are beneficial. But of course, this list, the key point of this list is that there is plenty of scope for reducing the cost of regulation on business. And what's very important to stress is that at the moment there is plenty of support for such a solid deregulation drive across the European Union. I mean, even a country like France, which is usually seen as the biggest potential obstacle to David Cameron's renegotiation in Europe, has said that it would be happy to hear proposals on how to reduce the red tape and the cost of regulation to business. So there is plenty of scope.
One of the biggest challenges is going to be for David Cameron to communicate with the electorate here in the United Kingdom. And you would maintain that leaving the EU, these costs don't disappear overnight, so he needs to communicate that. But you also advocate the Norway option as something for consideration. What is that? And just talk us through those two issues.
Well, the Norway option, we don't quite advocate that as an option, as a viable option for the UK, for a very simple reason. So Norway at the moment is a member of the European Economic Area. So it is a member of the single market, but that means that it has to comply with EU regulation without having a say on how that regulation is agreed on. So,
sorry, maybe advocate is the wrong word. You suggest that that is one route that they could go.
Yeah, it's one option that is mentioned.
But it is an option.
It's one option that is often mentioned as a possibility for UK-EU relations after a potential Brexit. But we don't think that's quite the best one, precisely because of this top 100 list. 93 regulations apply to the European Economic Area, so apply to Norway. So Norway has to bear the overwhelming majority of this cost without having a say on how these regulations are decided upon at the European Union level. And as regards the other point that you raised, of course, it has to be mentioned that Brexit would not mean an instant saving of 33 billion to the UK economy, because of course the UK outside of the EU would be more free to deregulate, but there would be obstacles to the regulation. I mean, our estimate, our politically feasible estimate is that the UK could save around 13 billion pounds in the regulation, but there will be obstacles. First of all, sometimes access to the EU market is subject to compliance with EU rules, so that could limit the scope for the UK for the regulation. Secondly, there will be domestic resistance, so there will be some politically sensitive issues, climate change being one of them, where in the UK there is cross-party consensus at the moment. So one has to be realistic about what the UK could actually achieve. There are some contenders for the regulation, the working time rules, rules on fund managers, for example, for the insurance sector, but there are other pieces of legislation. Let's think about, for example, anti-discrimination laws. I don't think the UK would ever want to repeal that, even outside of the EU.
Very quickly, Vincenzo, the EU is making progress on cutting red tape, isn't it? Very quickly, especially with the appointment of Frans Timmermans. Who's he?
This is a very important point, actually. Frans Timmermans is a former Dutch foreign minister who is sympathetic to the UK reform agenda, and at the moment he has been appointed as Vice President of the European Commission, specifically in charge for reducing red tape. And I think he has made a good start so far. He has adopted some interesting proposals, some of which have been advocated by Open Europe for a long example. Just to mention one, an independent body in charge of assessing EU regulation before it is